On June 5, 1944, First Lieutenant Richard Davis Winters stood in the marshalling area at Apottery Airfield in southern England and watched his men of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division prepare for the mission that would define their lives and change the course of history. 140 men checked equipment with methodical precision, born from 2 years of relentless training, tested weapons for the 100th time, adjusted parachute harnesses that would soon carry them into darkness over Nazi-occupied France, and tried to mask profound fear with nervous jokes and forced laughter that fooled nobody. These were the Screaming Eagles, paratroopers who had volunteered for the most dangerous duty in the United States Army. They had endured training that broke stronger men, learned skills that seemed impossible to master, and forged bonds of brotherhood that transcended normal human relationships. Within hours, they would jump from C-47 transport aircraft at 500 feet altitude into machine gun fire and anti-aircraft explosions, land scattered across Norman countryside in complete darkness, and begin fighting the most powerful military force the world had ever assembled. Many would not survive the night. All knew the stakes. This was D-Day, the invasion of Fortress Europe, and failure meant catastrophe. Lieutenant Winters was 26 years old, born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, into a middle-class family that valued education, hard work, and moral character. His father had served in World War I and instilled in young Richard a sense of duty and patriotism. Winters attended Franklin and Marshall College, studying business, participating in athletics, and developing leadership qualities that would serve him throughout his military career. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Winters was in his senior year. He immediately decided to enlist after graduation, choosing the Army and specifically requesting assignment to the newly forming airborne forces. The decision to volunteer for paratrooper training was not made lightly. The airborne was experimental, unproven, and extraordinarily dangerous, even in training. Parachute jumps killed soldiers regularly through equipment failures, landing injuries, and accidents. Combat jumps promised even higher casualties. But the airborne offered opportunities for rapid advancement, challenging duty, and service with elite forces. Winters wanted to test himself, to serve in the most demanding way possible, to make a difference in the war effort. He volunteered for Officer Candidate School, earned his commission as second lieutenant, and reported to Camp Toccoa, Georgia, in summer 1942 to join Easy Company. Camp Toccoa was located in the Appalachian foothills of northern Georgia, chosen specifically because the terrain provided excellent training opportunities for airborne forces. Mount Currahee rose 1,600 feet above the valley floor, a natural obstacle that would feature prominently in Easy Company's conditioning. The camp was new, hastily constructed, with wooden barracks, primitive facilities, and an atmosphere of controlled chaos as the Army rapidly expanded its airborne capabilities. Winters arrived at Toccoa as a junior officer and quickly found himself learning alongside the enlisted men who would become Easy Company. The original volunteers came from across America, representing an extraordinary cross-section of 1940s society. There was William Guarnere from South Philadelphia, tough Italian-American kid from the streets who spoke with a thick accent and fought with his fists before joining the Army. There was Joseph Toy from Reading, Pennsylvania, coal miner's son who was built like a tank and possessed physical strength that made him legendary. There was Donald Malarkey from Astoria, Oregon, college student and athlete who brought intelligence and determination to every task. Carwood Lipton came from Huntington, West Virginia, where he had been an excellent student and natural leader. He possessed calm demeanor and sound judgment that would make him invaluable in combat. Lewis Nixon was a Yale graduate from a wealthy family, sophisticated and urbane, who served as battalion intelligence officer but maintained close friendship with Winters despite their different backgrounds. Eugene Rowe was a Cajun from Louisiana, quiet medic who would save dozens of lives through courage and skill under fire. These men and 130 others reported to Toccoa between July and September 1942, forming Easy Company under command of Captain Herbert Sobel. Sobel was a complicated figure who would profoundly impact Easy Company despite eventually being relieved of command. He was a Jewish officer from Chicago, a martinet who demanded absolute perfection and punished any deviation harshly. Sobel was not popular. His leadership style created resentment, and his tactical incompetence worried officers who would have to follow him into combat. But Sobel's brutal training regimen produced extraordinary results. Training at Toccoa was deliberately designed to break men who lacked the physical toughness and mental determination required for airborne operations. The day began before dawn with physical training. Calisthenics, running, push-ups, sit-ups performed until muscles screamed and men collapsed from exhaustion. Then came Currahee. The mountain loomed over camp, 3 miles of steep trail that had to be run, not walked, with full combat equipment. Sobel led these runs, setting a brutal pace, and any man who fell behind was punished with weekend pass revocation, extra duty, or worse. The runs up Currahee became legendary. Men vomited from exertion, collapsed from heat exhaustion, suffered injuries from falls on rocky trail. But they ran. Day after day, week after week, month after month, they ran up that mountain. 3 miles up, 3 miles down became Easy Company's motto. The mountain broke some men who quit airborne training and returned to regular Army units. But those who endured emerged transformed, possessing cardiovascular fitness and mental toughness that would prove essential in combat. Physical training was only part of the regimen. The men learned parachute landing falls, practicing hundreds of times until the technique became automatic. They trained on mock-up aircraft, learning to exit quickly and safely. They practiced equipment jumps, learning to carry weapons and supplies while parachuting. They studied German weapons, tactics, and organization. They learned land navigation, first aid, and survival techniques. They practiced small unit tactics, learning to move, shoot, and communicate as coordinated teams. Sobel inspected everything obsessively. He examined rifles, finding microscopic specks of dirt, and assigning weekend pass revocations as punishment. He inspected uniforms, footlockers, and living quarters, demanding perfection and punishing deviations. He led forced marches that covered extraordinary distances, pushing men beyond what they believed possible. One march covered 118 miles in 3 days, an achievement that seemed impossible but demonstrated what properly conditioned paratroopers could accomplish. Winters observed Sobel's methods with mixed feelings. He respected the physical conditioning Sobel imposed and recognized how it prepared men for combat's demands. But he disagreed with Sobel's harsh discipline, and, particularly, with Sobel's tactical incompetence. Sobel frequently became lost during field exercises, made poor tactical decisions, and showed little understanding of infantry tactics beyond what he had memorized from manuals. These deficiencies worried Winters and other officers who knew combat would expose such weaknesses with fatal consequences. The conflict between Winters and Sobel grew during Toccoa training. Sobel seemed to single out Winters for particularly harsh treatment, perhaps recognizing Winters' natural leadership abilities as threat to his authority. He assigned Winters difficult tasks, punished him for minor infractions, and generally made life difficult. Winters endured this treatment with characteristic patience, focusing on his duties and maintaining his standards regardless of Sobel's harassment. In December 1942, Easy Company completed TOCOA training and moved to Fort Benning, Georgia, for formal parachute qualification training. Fort Benning was home to the Army's parachute school, where all airborne soldiers received standardized jump training. The course lasted several weeks and included ground training, tower training, and actual parachute jumps. Ground Week taught basic parachuting skills: how to don the parachute, how to check equipment, how to exit aircraft, how to control the canopy, how to execute landing falls. The training was repetitive and exhausting, with students performing hundreds of landing falls from increasingly higher platforms. Tower Week introduced actual jumping from towers, giving students taste of what parachuting felt like. The towers were 150 feet tall, and students were hoisted to the top, then released to descend under parachute canopies. The experience was terrifying for many, but built confidence. Jump Week was the culmination of training. Students made 5 qualification jumps from C-47 aircraft at altitudes around 1,000 feet. The first jump was individual, allowing each student to experience parachuting without distractions. Subsequent jumps included equipment, night operations, and mass tactical jumps that simulated combat conditions. Completing all 5 jumps earned students their silver parachute wings and authorization to wear distinctive paratrooper uniform. Easy Company completed jump school in January 1943, with all members successfully earning their wings. The company moved to Camp Mackle, North Carolina, for additional training as part of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Camp Mackle provided facilities for regiment and battalion-level training, allowing paratroopers to practice larger operations that would be required in combat. Training at Camp McCall emphasized combined arms operations, integrating paratroopers with artillery, engineers, and other supporting elements. Easy Company practiced company and battalion assaults, coordinating movement with supporting fires, communicating through radio and visual signals, and functioning as cohesive units rather than collections of individuals. The training was realistic and dangerous, conducted in all weather conditions, often at night, always pushing men to their limits. Field exercises lasted days or weeks, with companies moving cross-country, conducting reconnaissance, assaulting objectives, and defending positions. The exercises taught lessons that classrooms could not: how to navigate in darkness using only compass and stars, how to move silently through woods, how to coordinate attacks across broken terrain, how to function with minimal sleep and food. Men learned to trust their equipment, their training, and, most importantly, each other. Equipment was critical for airborne operations. Paratroopers carried everything they needed for combat in individual loads exceeding 100 pounds. The main parachute was T5 model, a round canopy that provided descent rate of approximately 22 feet per second. A reserve parachute was worn on the chest for emergency use. Weapons varied by role. Most riflemen carried M1 Garand rifles. Automatic riflemen had Browning automatic rifles. Machine gunners carried M1919, A6 machine guns broken down for transport. Mortar crews had 60mm or 81mm mortars. Personal equipment included combat uniform, steel helmet, boots, cartridge belt with ammunition pouches, canteen, first aid kit, entrenching tool, gas mask, grenades, and rations. Each man also carried specialized items based on his role. Medics carried extra medical supplies, radio men carried radio equipment, demolition men carried explosives. Getting all this equipment onto paratroopers and keeping it secure during jumps required careful packing and constant checking. The men of Easy Company formed close bonds during training. Shared hardship created friendships that transcended normal social boundaries. College graduates bunked with high school dropouts. City kids befriended farm boys. Regional, ethnic, and class differences that might have divided them in civilian life became irrelevant in face of common challenges. They learned to depend on each other absolutely, knowing their survival in combat would require complete trust in comrades. In September 1943, Easy Company and the entire 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment shipped to England aboard troop transport, joining the massive buildup of Allied forces preparing for invasion of France. The crossing took 2 weeks, with men packed into crowded troop compartments below decks. Seasickness affected many soldiers, making the voyage miserable. But eventually the convoy reached England, and the paratroopers disembarked at Liverpool. England, in late 1943, was an armed camp. American, British, and Canadian forces were gathering for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Southern England held vast supply depots, training areas, airfields, and marshalling camps. Security was extremely tight, with entire regions sealed off from civilians to prevent German intelligence from learning invasion plans. The buildup was so massive that soldiers joked England would sink from the weight. Easy Company was stationed initially at Aldbourne, a small village in Wiltshire that became home for the 506th Regiment. The men lived in Nissen huts, semi-cylindrical metal structures that were cold, damp, and crowded, but provided shelter. They trained constantly, conducting field exercises across English countryside, practicing jumps at nearby airfields, and preparing for combat operations. Interaction with English civilians was generally positive. The Americans were well paid compared to British soldiers and could afford to spend money in local pubs and shops. Some romances developed between American soldiers and English women. The cultural differences occasionally caused friction, but most contacts were friendly. The English had been at war for 4 years and welcomed the Americans as allies who would finally allow offensive operations against Nazi Germany. During winter, 1943 to 1944, tensions between Captain Sobel and his officers reached crisis point. The officers, led by Winters, had lost confidence in Sobel's tactical abilities and believed he would get men killed through incompetence. In extraordinary action, all Easy Company officers submitted written requests for transfer rather than serve under Sobel in combat. This near mutiny forced regimental command to act. The resolution was compromise. Sobel was reassigned to a jump training unit where his attention to detail would be valuable, but his tactical weaknesses would not endanger lives. Easy Company received new commander, First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, who was well-liked and tactically competent. Winters was promoted to first lieutenant and designated as Meehan's executive officer. The change in command improved morale considerably, with men feeling confident in their leadership. Training intensified in spring 1944 as D-Day approached. Easy Company conducted practice jumps, field exercises, and coordination training with other units. They received specialized equipment, including leg bags for carrying extra ammunition and supplies, new radios for better communications, and updated weapons. Intelligence briefings provided information about German defenses in France, though specific details about invasion location remained closely guarded secret. In late May, Easy Company moved to marshalling areas near Apottery Airfield, one of many airfields in southern England designated for airborne operations. Security became even tighter, with entire areas sealed off, and no communication with outside world permitted. The men knew invasion was imminent, but not exactly when or where. Briefings began revealing details. Maps showed Norman coastline. Aerial photographs displayed beach defenses, inland terrain, and German positions. Officers described specific missions: secure causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, destroy bridges to prevent German reinforcements, capture road junctions, create chaos behind German lines. Intelligence estimated German strength, though these estimates would prove inaccurate. The plan called for two American airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, to jump inland from beaches hours before amphibious landings. The paratroopers would seize key terrain, disrupt German communications and reinforcements, and prevent counterattacks against vulnerable troops landing on beaches. If paratroopers failed, beach landings might fail, and entire invasion might end in catastrophe. Easy Company's specific mission included securing Causeway Number 2, one of 4 raised roads leading inland from Utah Beach across flooded marshland. The causeways were critical because tanks and vehicles could not traverse flooded areas and would be restricted to these narrow roads. German defenders knew this and had positioned forces to defend the causeways. Taking them required airborne forces to attack before beach landings began. On June 5th, after 24-hour delay due to bad weather, Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower made the momentous decision. Invasion would proceed on June 6th. Paratroopers received final briefings, checked equipment one last time, attended religious services if they wished, and wrote letters home knowing many would not return. Evening of June 5th brought time for final preparations. Men blackened their faces with charcoal and applied camouflage paint. They loaded weapons, filled ammunition pouches, attached grenades to webbing, packed rations and water. They helped each other don parachutes and adjust harnesses. They checked equipment repeatedly, knowing their lives depended on everything functioning perfectly. As darkness fell, Easy Company boarded C-47 transport aircraft. Each plane carried stick of 18 paratroopers, plus equipment bundles suspended beneath aircraft fuselage. Men sat on uncomfortable benches facing each other in aircraft cabin, heavily loaded with equipment, unable to move freely. Lieutenant Meehan commanded from the lead aircraft. Winters was in another plane. The company was distributed across multiple aircraft to prevent single loss from destroying entire unit. The flight across English Channel began around 2200 hours. Aircraft flew in formations, hundreds of transports carrying over 13,000 American paratroopers toward France. The flight was tense. Men tried to sleep, but most remained awake, minds racing, checking equipment repeatedly, talking quietly, or sitting in silent contemplation. Some prayed. Others wrote last letters. All thought about what awaited them. As formations approached French coast around midnight, German anti-aircraft fire erupted. Batteries along coast had been warned of approaching aircraft and opened fire with everything available. 88mm guns threw up walls of explosions. 20mm automatic cannons filled sky with tracer rounds. The defensive fire was far heavier than planners had expected. Pilots took evasive action, breaking formations, diving, climbing, turning violently to avoid fire. Lieutenant Meehan's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed with no survivors. The loss of company commander before anyone even jumped was a catastrophic blow, though surviving paratroopers would not learn of it until later. Other aircraft carrying Easy Company men scattered across sky, seeking their drop zones while evading German fire. Some planes were hit and went down. Others became lost, unable to locate correct drop zones in darkness. When green lights illuminated, paratroopers jumped into night sky over Normandy. They exited aircraft into prop wash, were jerked violently as parachutes opened, then descended through darkness toward unknown terrain. German machine gun fire and anti-aircraft tracers arced through sky. Some paratroopers were hit while still in air. Others landed in trees, on buildings, in water. The carefully planned drops dissolved into chaos. Lieutenant Winters landed in field several miles from Easy Company's designated drop zone. He was alone, separated from his men, in darkness in enemy territory. Following his training, he located his leg bag containing extra ammunition, freed himself from parachute harness, found his rifle, and began moving toward sound of firing to locate other paratroopers. The airborne landings scattered paratroopers across 50 square miles of Norman countryside. Men landed miles from drop zones, separated from units, uncertain of locations. Small groups formed gradually as individuals found each other using cricket clickers that made distinctive clicking sounds. Flash and thunder were password and countersign. Anyone who did not know them was assumed to be enemy. Winters gradually assembled approximately 12 men from Easy Company and other units during first hours after landing. None of the men were from his own platoon. They represented mix of regiments and companies, thrown together by chaos of drop. But they were paratroopers, trained to operate independently, capable of functioning without higher command. Winters organized them into effective combat team and set out to accomplish whatever mission presented itself. As dawn approached, Winters' small group encountered Lieutenant Harry Welsh, another Easy Company officer who had assembled roughly 10 men. Combined force now numbered approximately 22 paratroopers. They compared notes on their locations, discussed German dispositions based on observed activity, and decided to move toward sounds of heavy firing near coast, where other paratroopers were presumably fighting. Moving cross-country in enemy territory was extraordinarily dangerous. German patrols were searching for paratroopers. Snipers covered roads and trails. Every hedgerow could conceal enemy positions. Winters' group moved carefully, using cover, maintaining interval between men, ready to fight at any moment. The tension was exhausting, every step potentially fatal, every sound possibly signaling enemy contact. Around 0600 hours, Winters' group linked up with Lieutenant Thomas Compton, who had assembled additional Easy Company men. Combined force now numbered approximately 40 paratroopers from Easy Company and other units. Winters assumed command based on his rank and organized the force for tactical operations. They were still miles from intended objectives, but represented effective combat force capable of offensive action. Movement toward coast brought them near Bricourt Manor, a French farmstead approximately 500 yards inland from Causeway No. 2. German artillery was firing from positions at the manor, the guns hammering Utah Beach, where American troops were landing. The artillery was causing casualties among troops struggling ashore and needed to be silenced immediately. Winters observed the German position from covered location, approximately 300 yards away. He could see 4 artillery pieces, probably 75mm or 105mm guns, positioned to fire toward beach. German infantry defended positions, maybe 50 soldiers total. Machine gun nests covered approaches. Trenches connected gun positions. It was well-organized defensive position that would be difficult to assault. Winters had approximately 40 lightly armed paratroopers against 50 entrenched Germans with artillery and machine guns. Conventional wisdom suggested avoiding such engagements or at minimum waiting for reinforcements and heavy weapons. But the artillery was killing Americans on beach. Every minute it continued firing meant more casualties. Winters decided to attack immediately with forces available. He organized classic infantry assault using fire and maneuver. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Suppressing fire from majority of force would pin German defenders, while assault element maneuvered to flank German positions. Once in position, assault element would attack trenches with grenades and rifles, destroying guns one by one. Subsequent assault waves would exploit success, rolling up German position from flank. Winters personally led first assault element, taking approximately 12 men. The rest provided suppressing fire from their initial positions. When fire superiority was achieved, Winters led his group forward in rush, covering 200 yards of open ground under fire. They reached first German trench, threw grenades, then jumped in fighting hand-to-hand with any surviving defenders. The first gun was destroyed with thermite grenades that melted critical components. German defenders responded, directing machine gun fire at assault element. Winters called for more suppressive fire from main position. Men fired hundreds of rounds, keeping German heads down. With covering fire established, Winters led attack on second gun position, repeating same tactics: rush forward, throw grenades, assault trench, destroy gun. The second artillery piece was knocked out. By this point, German commander recognized serious threat and began organizing counterattack. Winters needed reinforcements for next assault. He sent Runner back to main position requesting additional men. Private Popeye Wynne came forward with small group. Together they assaulted third gun position, again using fire and maneuver. Third gun was destroyed, but Wynne was wounded in assault and had to be evacuated. The fourth and final gun position was most difficult. German defenders had concentrated remaining forces, established overlapping fields of fire, and prepared to resist. Winters organized careful assault, coordinating fires more deliberately, using smoke grenades to obscure movement, advancing by squads rather than rushing with small groups. The assault succeeded. Fourth gun was destroyed, and surviving German defenders withdrew. The entire action lasted approximately 2 hours from initial observation to final gun destruction. Winters' force suffered 4 casualties, all wounded, with none killed. German losses were estimated at 15 killed, 12 wounded, and several captured. 4 artillery pieces that had been hammering Utah Beach were permanently silenced. The assault became textbook example of small unit tactics, demonstrating how aggressive, well-led force could defeat numerically superior enemy in prepared positions. The action at Brecourt Manor earned Winters Distinguished Service Cross, second highest American military decoration for valor. More importantly, it demonstrated Easy Company's combat effectiveness and Winters' exceptional leadership. Word spread through regiment about the assault, establishing Winters' reputation as outstanding combat leader. Easy Company spent following days fighting through Norman hedgerows, distinctive earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that divided fields and created natural fortifications. The hedgerows made Normandy defenders' paradise. Each field was separate battlefield, with limited visibility, multiple German defensive positions, and approaches covered by machine guns and mortars. Attacking through hedgerow country meant assaulting one fortified position after another, casualties mounting steadily. Progress measured in yards rather than miles. The fighting was exhausting both physically and psychologically. Men moved bent over or crawling, seeking cover from German fire. They carried heavy loads in summer heat, sweating through uniforms, becoming dehydrated and exhausted. Sleep was minimal, measured in minutes rather than hours. Food was cold rations eaten whenever brief lulls in fighting allowed. The stress was relentless, danger constant, fear ever present. Private Albert Blythe had fought effectively at Brecourt Manor, but later suffered psychological breakdown that temporarily blinded him. The condition was hysterical blindness, caused by psychological trauma rather than physical injury. Winters spoke with Blythe, learning about his fear and encouraging him to continue. With support, Blythe recovered his sight and returned to duty. He fought effectively subsequently, but was eventually wounded and evacuated. His case illustrated how psychological casualties affected even well-trained soldiers. Sergeant Denver Randleman became separated during night patrol and spent several days hiding from German patrols before reaching American lines. His survival required fieldcraft skills, determination, and luck. Being alone in enemy territory was terrifying experience, every sound potentially signaling discovery, every moment requiring absolute discipline to remain hidden. Randleman's safe return was celebrated, but his ordeal reminded everyone how quickly paratroopers could become isolated and vulnerable. First Sergeant William Evans was killed when German artillery scored direct hit on his position during fighting near Carentan. Evans had been with Easy Company since Tocoa, respected non-commissioned officer essential to unit operations. His death devastated Company and demonstrated cruel randomness of artillery fire. Skill and experience offered no protection when shells fell. Men could be excellent soldiers and still die from random explosion they never saw coming. Easy Company participated in assault on Carentan, key Normantown controlling road junction that connected American landing beaches. Capturing Carentan would allow link-up between Utah and Omaha beaches, creating continuous beachhead. German defenders recognized Carentan's importance and fortified it heavily. The battle required house-to-house fighting, assaulting machine gun positions, clearing buildings, advancing under mortar and artillery fire. The fighting was intense and costly. Easy Company attacked across open ground toward town, taking casualties from German fire. Once in town, combat became close-quarters battle in streets and buildings. German snipers occupied upper floors. Machine guns covered intersections. Mortars fired from positions throughout town. Every advance was contested. Every building had to be cleared. Casualties mounted steadily. Easy Company suffered multiple losses during Carentan fighting. Several men were killed. Many more were wounded. The survivors were exhausted, ammunition running low, nerves frayed from days of continuous combat. But Carentan fell, securing vital road junction and allowing Allied forces to expand beachhead. The victory came at terrible price, but achieved critical strategic objective. By early July 1944, Easy Company had been in continuous combat for nearly a month. Original 140 men who jumped on D-Day had been reduced to fewer than 90 effectives. Company had received replacements, but new men needed time to integrate and lacked combat experience. Equipment was worn, weapons needed maintenance, men desperately needed rest. The company was withdrawn from front lines and returned to England for rest, refitting and training of replacements. The men who boarded ships for England were different from those who had jumped into France. They had seen friends killed, witnessed horrible suffering. Learned combat was far worse than any training could prepare them for. They had also discovered their own capabilities, finding courage they didn't know they possessed, developing confidence in their skills. Rest in England provided time to recover physically and somewhat psychologically. Men slept in real beds, ate hot food, took showers, wore clean uniforms. They wrote letters home, visited nearby towns, drank in pubs, tried to relax. But memories of combat intruded constantly. Some had nightmares, others startled at loud noises. Few discussed their experiences, keeping fears and trauma private. Easy Company received approximately 40 replacements. Young soldiers fresh from training who would have to learn combat realities quickly. Veterans tried to teach them, sharing lessons learned at terrible cost. Keep your head down, trust your equipment, watch for snipers, never bunch up under fire, always dig foxholes deep. The replacements listened but couldn't truly understand until they experienced combat themselves. Training resumed in England, preparing for next operation. Rumors circulated about where they would fight. Some thought return to France. Others speculated about jumps into Belgium or Germany. Nobody knew specifics, but all knew combat awaited. The brief respite would end, and they would once again face danger and death. In mid-September 1944, Easy Company learned their next mission, Operation Market Garden. Massive airborne assault designed to seize bridges across major rivers in Holland and create corridor into Germany. The operation involved 3 Allied airborne divisions jumping to capture bridges while British armored forces drove north along Single Road to link up with paratroopers. If successful, Market Garden might end war by Christmas. If it failed, thousands of paratroopers would be stranded behind German lines. The plan was extraordinarily ambitious, requiring perfect execution and assuming German resistance would be light. Both assumptions proved optimistic. German forces in Holland were stronger than intelligence estimated, and coordination between airborne and ground forces proved difficult. But in mid-September, optimism prevailed. Allied forces were advancing rapidly across France. Germany appeared to be collapsing. One more bold stroke might finish the war. Easy Company jumped near Eindhoven, Holland on September 17, 1944. Unlike D-Day chaos, this was daylight operation with good visibility and accurate drops. Most of Easy Company landed near objectives and quickly assembled. Initial German resistance was light, with company seizing designated positions and linking up with British armored forces advancing from south within hours. But Operation Market Garden quickly encountered serious problems. At Arnhem, northernmost objective where British 1st Airborne Division was supposed to capture bridge, German resistance proved far stronger than expected. 2 SS Panzer divisions happened to be refitting in area and counterattacked British paratroopers with tanks and heavy weapons. British forces were surrounded, cut off from reinforcement, and eventually destroyed despite heroic resistance. The single narrow road British armor traveled became congested and vulnerable to German attacks. Progress slowed to crawl as German forces counterattacked from flanks. The operation stalled short of Arnhem. British paratroopers holding the bridge were overwhelmed. Market Garden failed to achieve its objectives, but succeeded in liberating much of southern Holland and establishing Allied presence north of major rivers. Easy Company spent weeks in Holland conducting defensive operations, patrolling, and occasional offensive actions. Fighting was less intense than Normandy, but danger remained constant. German snipers took steady toll. Artillery fell regularly. Patrol clashes produced casualties. Weather turned cold and wet, making living conditions miserable. Trench foot affected many soldiers. Debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions that could make walking impossible. Disease also took toll. Dysentery affected men living in unsanitary field conditions without proper facilities. Respiratory illnesses spread through units living in cold, damp foxholes. Combat exhaustion accumulated, physical and psychological stress wearing men down. Easy Company needed rest, but operations continued with only brief pauses. In November, Easy Company finally returned to France and moved to rest area near Mourmelon-le-Grand. The men expected quiet December, time to rest and recover before next operation. They settled into routine of light training, equipment maintenance, and recreation. Some men obtained passes to Paris, others simply enjoyed not being shot at. Christmas looked like it might be peaceful. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched massive surprise offensive through Ardennes Forest in Belgium, shattering American lines and creating crisis that threatened to split Allied forces. German armored divisions smashed through thinly held American positions, advanced rapidly westward, created huge bulge in Allied front. American units were surrounded, supply lines threatened, commanders feared catastrophic defeat. The German offensive, Battle of the Bulge, achieved complete strategic surprise. American intelligence had failed to detect German buildup. Weather prevented aerial reconnaissance. German communications security was excellent. The attack came at time and place, where Americans were least prepared. Initial German success was spectacular, recalling their victories earlier in war. Allied command responded by rushing every available unit toward Ardennes to contain breakthrough. 101st Airborne Division, including Easy Company, received orders to move immediately to Bastogne, key Belgian road junction Germans needed to capture for their offensive to succeed. Paratroopers loaded onto trucks on December 18th, many without winter clothing or adequate ammunition, and raced toward Belgium. They arrived in Bastogne on December 19th, just before German forces completed encirclement. The town sat at center of critical road network. 7 roads converged at Bastogne, making it essential for German logistics and maneuver. Capturing Bastogne would allow Germans to continue their offensive. Holding it would disrupt German plans. German forces surrounded Bastogne on December 21st, cutting off garrison and demanding surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding 101st Airborne, received German surrender demand and replied with single word written on paper. "Nuts! Dirty?" When German officers asked for clarification, American officer explained it meant "go to hell." The defenders prepared to hold Bastogne regardless of cost. Easy Company defended positions outside Bastogne in Bois-Jacques, forested area that provided limited cover but offered clear fields of fire toward German positions. Conditions were terrible beyond anything they had experienced. Snow covered everything. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit and below. Men lacked adequate winter clothing, suffering frostbite on fingers, toes, ears, noses. Food was rationed severely. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies were exhausted treating casualties. Foxholes had to be dug in frozen ground. Impossible task requiring hours of work with entrenching tools to create shallow depressions that provided minimal protection. 2 men shared each foxhole for warmth, taking turns sleeping and standing watch. They huddled together, sharing body heat, trying to stay alive through nights that seemed endless. Artillery and mortar fire fell constantly. German gunners knew American positions and pounded them relentlessly. Shells burst in trees, showering defenders with wooden splinters and shrapnel. Men cowered in foxholes during barrages, praying shells would miss, knowing any second they might be killed or maimed. The psychological stress was enormous. Relentless bombardment, wearing nerves raw. German infantry probed American positions regularly, seeking weak points, testing defenses, launching attacks when they detected vulnerabilities. Easy Company fought off multiple attacks, sometimes in close combat with grenades and rifles at ranges measured in yards. The fighting was vicious, desperate struggle for survival in freezing darkness. Private Eugene Rowe, Easy Company's medic, worked tirelessly treating wounded under impossible conditions. He ran from foxhole to foxhole during firefights, exposing himself to enemy fire to reach casualties. He administered morphine for pain, bandaged wounds with supplies that were running out, provided comfort to dying men. His courage and dedication saved lives and earned profound respect from every man in Easy Company. Supplies dropped by parachute when weather permitted. C-47 transports flew through German anti-aircraft fire to drop bundles of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Some supplies landed in German-held territory. Others were destroyed when they hit ground, but enough got through to keep defenders fighting. Private Joe Toy and Sergeant Bill Guarnere were both severely wounded by same artillery shell on January 3, 1945. The shell landed near their foxhole, shrapnel tearing through both men's legs. Toy lost part of his leg. Guarnere's leg was mangled beyond saving. Both men were evacuated under fire, medics working frantically to stop bleeding and prevent shock. Their survival was testament to rapid medical treatment and subsequent surgery, but both lost legs and their combat careers were over. The siege of Bastogne lasted until December 26th, when elements of General George Patton's Third Army broke through German lines from south and relieved garrison. Patton had turned his entire army 90 degrees, disengaged from operations along German border, and driven north through terrible weather to reach Bastogne. The relief column's arrival was celebrated, but fighting continued around Bastogne into January as Allies pushed Germans back. Easy Company remained in line through January battles, continuing to suffer casualties, enduring cold that seemed endless, fighting Germans who were now retreating but still dangerous. Men developed frostbite despite precautions. Some lost toes or fingers to cold. Others developed pneumonia or bronchitis from prolonged exposure. The toll was terrible, not just combat casualties, but cold weather injuries that disabled men as effectively as wounds. In late January 1945, Easy Company was finally pulled from line for rest. Men had been in combat or near combat conditions for over a month in worst weather imaginable. They were exhausted physically and psychologically, suffering from frostbite, traumatized by losses, badly needing respite. The company moved to rear areas where they received hot food, warm quarters, showers, clean clothes, and time to recover. Lieutenant Winters was promoted to captain and assigned as battalion executive officer, leaving Easy Company command. His departure was emotional, Winters having led company through its worst battles and earned absolute loyalty from his men. He was succeeded by First Lieutenant Frederick Haliger, who proved to be capable leader but was later wounded. Command then passed to First Lieutenant Norman Dyke, who unfortunately proved to be ineffective leader, hesitant and indecisive in combat. February and March 1945 brought Allied offensives pushing into Germany. Wehrmacht was collapsing, losing coherence, unable to conduct effective defense. German units surrendered in increasing numbers. Fuel shortages immobilized armored forces. Ammunition ran short. Luftwaffe was almost non-existent. End of war was approaching rapidly. Easy Company crossed Rhine River in March and advanced into southern Germany. They moved through areas where German resistance varied wildly. Some units fought fanatically. Others surrendered immediately. Civilians' reactions ranged from hostile to welcoming. The chaos of collapsing Germany presented constant challenges. In April, Easy Company participated in liberation of Kaufering concentration camp complex near Landsberg. Paratroopers found thousands of emaciated prisoners, evidence of systematic starvation and brutality, facilities designed for mass murder. The experience affected every man who entered camps, confronting them with evil beyond imagination, reinforcing understanding of why they fought. Easy Company veterans later described camp liberation as most disturbing experience of entire war. Combat was terrible, but comprehensible. Men fought each other, killed or were killed. But camps revealed deliberate systematic cruelty on industrial scale. The paratroopers had known abstractly about Nazi atrocities, but seeing evidence firsthand was profoundly shocking. In early May 1945, Easy Company reached Berchtesgaden and Hitler's Eagle's Nest in Bavarian Alps. They arrived shortly after German surrender on May 8th, finding area abandoned but intact. The symbolic significance was enormous. Paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy nearly a year earlier had fought across France, Belgium, and Germany to reach Hitler's personal retreat. The war in Europe ended. Easy Company had survived. Of 140 men who jumped on D-Day, approximately 48 were killed in action during subsequent year. Dozens more were wounded, some multiple times. Company received over 300 replacements during war, many of whom also became casualties. The cost had been terrible, but they had accomplished every mission assigned. Lieutenant Richard Winters survived war, earning promotion to major and receiving numerous decorations, including Distinguished Service Cross. He returned to Pennsylvania after war, lived quietly, raised family, and rarely spoke about combat experiences. He worked in business, maintained friendships with Easy Company veterans, and lived to age 92, dying in 2011. Other survivors returned to civilian life, built careers, raised families, tried to process what they had experienced. Some struggled with psychological trauma, nightmares, depression, difficulty adjusting to peacetime. Others adapted relatively well, channeling wartime experiences into productive lives. All were marked permanently by their service. Decades later, historian Stephen Ambrose interviewed Easy Company veterans, producing book Band of Brothers that told their story to new generations. Published in 1992, book became bestseller, introducing readers to remarkable men who had fought with extraordinary courage. HBO produced television miniseries based on book, bringing Easy Company's story to even wider audience. Veterans who had rarely discussed their service found themselves celebrated as heroes. Reunions brought together survivors who had not seen each other for decades. They shared memories, honored fallen comrades, and reflected on what they had accomplished together. The attention was sometimes uncomfortable for men who considered themselves ordinary people who had done their duty. Easy Company's story represents experiences of millions who fought in World War II. They were not superhuman. They felt fear, exhaustion, doubt. They made mistakes, struggled with trauma, suffered losses that haunted them forever. But they did their duty, supported their comrades, and helped defeat tyranny that threatened civilization. Their legacy endures in military training, where their actions are studied as examples of effective small unit tactics and leadership. It endures in popular culture through books, films, and documentaries. Most importantly, it endures in memory of what ordinary people can accomplish when tested by extraordinary circumstances. The paratroopers of Easy Company jumped into darkness over Normandy, not knowing if they would survive the night. They fought through hedgerows, cities, forests, and mountains across Europe. They endured casualties that would have broken lesser units. They accomplished every mission despite impossible odds. And they did it together. Band of brothers forged in crucible of combat, united by shared sacrifice and unbreakable bonds that transcended normal human relationships.